Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Heitzen, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started out at procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today is the second of 3 bonus episodes that I thought I would publish this week as we get closer to 2022, reflecting on sessions that I have particularly enjoyed during our major flagship events of 2021. And this second episode is from Categorypalooza 2021, which we held back in late August, where Betsy Pancik, Joe Adamski, and Nick Buitrago from ProcureAbility consider the challenges with getting accurate data to inform our buying strategies. And they offer some tips on how to overcome those challenges. Now, this session was expertly moderated by Betsy, so I'm going to hand things over and go straight into the session.
So the first topic that we're going to tackle here today is one that I know a lot of procurement organizations struggle with, which is data. I don't have enough data. I have too much data. I don't have the right insights from my data, and I'm not really sure what to do with it. And so I want to bring in my colleagues, Joe and Nick, who are going to help us today as we talk a little bit more about defining what really is the problem with procurement data? What sort of impact does that have on your organization? And then most importantly, what can you do about it? This is all based on, our experience as a procurement services provider. And, so we hope to kind of tell some stories along the way too, to really make it feel more relatable. So why don't we move to the next slide? And so Joe and Nick, I'm going to bring you into the conversation now. So, maybe you could help with really defining what do you see in your experience as the problem with procurement data? Maybe Joe, I'll start with you, and then Nick, you can chime in.
Sure. I think one of the things that most everyone would be familiar with is we are swimming in data. It's everywhere. It's constantly coming at us. There's just the sheer amount of information that is available to us from our systems, from our suppliers, from the market, from any source that you can think of. It's stunning. In fact, they've said that at the end of 2020 there were 44 zettabytes of data that existed in the world. Wow. It doesn't sound like a lot in and of itself, but since none of us are really familiar with what a zettabyte is, and I did have to look it up, that is 44 trillion gigabytes of information. And they say that 94% of that exists in a virtual format. It's all just online. It's data that we need to be able to absorb. So out of all of that information, the challenge that we have is being able to extract insights from it. What is that signal to noise? How do we use the data in order to actually be effective? How can we get that information, get something useful out of that sea of data that's out there? And that's, I think, the first place that we struggle with. The second is in using that information. So people think the data is just going to tell them what they need to know. So they'll look at the data and they try to figure out, well, what is the story? What is the narrative? What am I hearing from this? And the reality is that's the wrong way to look at it, because the data by itself, it's just sitting there. It's static. It's individual points of facts. It's individual bits of information. It's not going to give you insight by itself. That's one of the challenges that we face in trying to pull that together. And then the third area is, with all of that information that's come in, how you process data, how you gather data, what you do with it, how often you need to look at it, all of that has changed. So if you're still doing things the same way today that you were doing 10 years ago, if you're looking at indexes on a quarterly basis and saying, yep, well, our input costs are good, or they vary just a little bit, or you're only talking to your suppliers once a year, to see if they've got anything new for you and reviewing any issues that have happened in the last 12 months, you're behind. That you are going to be missing opportunities. You're going to have problems that you don't anticipate. You're going to be blindsided continually. That's going to be, that is going to be an issue for you if you don't adjust to the times.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I guess, Nick, I'm wondering if you have anything to add. I mean, Joe kind of went through, what was on the slide here, but do you have any specific In your experience, like what have you seen clients struggle with when it comes to procurement data?
I mean, frankly, I've seen just a couple pitfalls with clients. So the first one is obviously analysis paralysis. There's just too much data. There's essentially the sea metaphor, where you're trying to uh, get a glass and get the right cup of water from the ocean, and that just doesn't work. So you have to really focus on the most important data. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is kind of a focus on historicals, assuming that those historicals are going to apply in the future. And that might have been true a couple years back, but that's simply not true anymore. The market is unlike anything we've seen in the past decade. We're looking at all of these changes happening. We're in an inflationary environment as opposed to a stationary one. And so when we look at the estimate of for example, when we look at the estimate of inflation this year of potentially 10%, even if half of that 5%, that's still 5 times what we've seen in the past couple of years. And so essentially all boils down to data is going to be a little bit wackier, a little bit more difficult to parse our head around. And so to be effective, you really have to hone in on what's the question I want to answer, what's the data that would give me that answer, and how do I parse through and how do I effectively use it.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think that, I mean, in our experience as procurement people, we've probably experienced just like an absolute mass probably in the last 2 or 3 years. Like more has happened with the technology and just the whole science of data over the last 2 or 3 years that probably happened in the 20 years before it. So I think some of this is like, we're sort of playing catch up with the technology and the capabilities, but also we are trying to figure out as procurement people, what of the methods that we used to always rely on can we still use in this new world? And which ones do we need to perhaps refresh or even just completely discard? So why don't we move on to the next slide, and let's talk a little bit more about, how do these problems impact procurement organizations? And again, Joel, I'll start with you. I mean, what has been your experience in terms of, when we talk about we have too much data, we don't really even know what we're trying to get from the data. How does that impact procurement organizations today?
Sure. I think one of the first things that we see in people's reaction to the sheer amount of data is they think that they need to process all of it. It's related to the idea that the data is going to tell you what you need to know versus you having to figure out what you're trying to solve for. So we've all called it analysis paralysis. It's just people spend an excessive amount of time digging through the data, trying to extract some sort of an insight, but really getting lost and heading down rabbit holes, looking for a particular needle in a haystack, and just not really finding what they're looking for. The flip side is we have people that look at all the information and throw their hands up and say, well, there's nothing, I can't even deal with this. I can't find what I'm looking for. There's too much that's here. And that oftentimes, both lead to missed savings opportunities, but that one definitely does. Working with a client today, right now, we looked at some of their contracts around their freight handling. So where they're working with their particular trucking company, they have certain things on contract. That contract was set a couple of years ago. What we found is that the supplier is doing other things for them that were not part of the original agreement. So they don't have any negotiated pricing on it. They weren't even really aware that those services were taking place, and they're not being done in an optimized manner. There are better solutions that they have available for it, but they just were not aware of it because the sheer amount of data that was coming in from the supplier. If you think about, how many individual lanes most companies have as they're moving trucks around, no one looked at it that closely. No one really dug into it. And we're seeing, significant savings opportunities just by getting that back under control. You're not going to hear from your suppliers if you're not engaging with them, if you're not being able to dig into the data. The suppliers will come to you with ideas, but if you're not familiar with the data, if you're not digging into it deeply, you don't know how to evaluate their proposals to look at it and say, well, is this really value add? Is this a win-win or not? I've had another client. They've had one of their suppliers come to them, again, inflationary environment, but they've had one of their suppliers come to them and say, hey, you buy the same stuff regularly. We can lock in 6 months of inventory for you right now. We will manage it. We will not charge you any cost for storage of it. We will hold it for you and do it and everything that you can possibly need. If you're willing to lock in, because we're seeing the prices are increasing significantly over time, are you willing to do that? It's taken a little bit of time to scrub through the data, even just to be able to evaluate the offer from the supplier, which was made in good faith, because that supplier is, they're trying to fill their own volume, of course, but they're also recognizing that there's an issue and trying to help their own customers, my client, out. But without being able to dig into the data and truly analyze it, they don't know if they should say yes or no. I think a third area that we run into is around making data-driven decisions. We all talk about that. We all want to be able to do that, but it's a challenge if you're not actually familiar with the data. I worked with a client a few years ago where the work was a cultural transformation to move them from call it a gut-driven decision-making model, very much shooting from the hip, to one that was data-driven. And it was putting in the right metrics. It was conditioning people to understand what they meant, what they were being evaluated against. Really, the idea was that everyone would have the ability to understand how what they did tied to either the top line or the bottom line. But I got one of my favorite quotes given to me from a client during that, which was, well, Joe, if we wanted to do this, we would have done it a long time ago. Or if this is how we want to run the company, we would have done it a long time ago. It's like, well, my response was, well, that's why I'm here, because this is the way your leadership wants to.
Yeah, because you didn't. I think that's a great point. And, one of the things that is kind of we talk a lot about what does it mean to be a good category manager, and just this wide array of skills that you need to have to be truly effective as a category manager. And when you consider that, a lot of it is relationship based and being able to build relationships and work through problems. But we can't overlook the analysis piece of it. And, I think that there's a temptation sometimes as people rise in their careers to say, oh, I've got a team that can do that for me. I don't really need to, dig into the details of the data. I don't really need to dig into all of the ups and downs of, which suppliers are we using and how much are we spending with each and how are they performing and, what are the other sources of supply? Because I've got teams, that kind of arm me with that data. But, and I don't know, Nick, I don't know about you, but like for me, if I'm not in the details, it just doesn't really land with me. So there's a temptation sometimes, as we become more important to an organization, to kind of let other people do some of this work. But, it's really important that procurement people don't lose the capability to analyze, don't lose the capability to read data and understand what it's telling us. So just curious if you have anything else to add about that or anything else left on this slide.
No, that's exactly it, Betsy. It's all about credibility. By having that muscle to know what's important and to validate the strategy. That way, it's not just about having the credibility to bring down costs. It's about having the credibility to recommend value, and value is about more than cost. Value is that fundamental mindset shift where you get cost savings, you get better supplier relationships, you get stakeholders on board, internal business stakeholders that don't want to see supply shortages, that don't want to see product changes or emergencies and wildfires. They just want everything to go smoothly. And so when you demonstrate value, you build that credibility, you get leadership, you get the business to say, yes, we love what you're doing. And even if we have to move away from pure supply chain efficiency, what you're doing with building that resiliency, that supply chain resiliency, there's always going to be a bit of a contrast between those two. But if you get the right balance, that's where you get that sweet spot. Yeah,
no, that's a very good point. And obviously super relevant, not just for, some of the supply issues that we're seeing, but, coming, fingers crossed, at least emerging from the pandemic, or certainly don't have it behind us, but, starting to see what post-pandemic life is going to look like. And, what kind of supply chains, do we need to have, and how can we use data to help us, really make those decisions. So a lot of this has really just been kind of context setting for the next slide. Pip, if you want to move forward one. So we want to really spend the rest of our time in this session talking about, okay, so what do I do about this? We've established that there's a ton of data out there. We don't start with the questions that we have for the data. We don't start with, what is it that we're looking to get from the data? We kind of look at the data and try to solve it. We talked about the fact that, maybe there's a little bit of procurement 101 that we've gotten away from. And also that, there's temptations to kind of allow the tools and allow, some of the analytics teams to do the work for you instead of, kind of really rolling up your sleeves. So what do we do about all this? So Joe, again, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on how organizations can better equip themselves to make the most of their procurement data?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when you get a data set, particularly as one that you haven't really dealt with before, there is always a little bit of value of just poking at it and just understanding what's there, understanding what the fields are, kind of just getting your arms around what the data is. And that's fine when it's the first time you're looking at something. But when you're actually trying to deal with data, the important thing is to start off with, what are you trying to solve for? Spend the time up front. In classic consulting speak, what are your hypotheses? But it's very true. What do you think you're going to find? What are you looking for in the data? What are you trying to extract? What are the insights that you're actually looking for? And once you know what you're looking for, then you can figure out how to structure the analysis in order to address the data to be able to extract those insights from it. You don't want to do as we said up front, you don't want to do the opposite. If you just look at the data, it is just this massive ocean of information as far as the eye can see. You don't know if it's a mile deep or a mile wide. You're just stuck in the middle of it. But if you know what you're actually solving for, then you can actually get to the point of what you're looking at and verify or reject the hypotheses of what you're looking for. Simple things. It sometimes can be very, very simple. I mean, just looking at the data and trying to understand why were things happening. Come up with your hypotheses, and then it lets you go in and test for it. Working with a client, just looking at their telecom data. They have weird random spikes in usage that they can't really explain. So we sat down and figured out what were the potential things that could be causing that. And then you dig into the data and try to figure it out. And then along the way, you might generate new insights that you hadn't anticipated. Like in this case, find out that there were people who are no longer employees of the company that are still being, have cell phones that the company's paying for. Let's get those turned off. But that might be an unexpected piece, but you dig through those in order to find the insights that you're looking for. Looking a little bit big picture, when you're looking at dashboards, when you're looking at trying to craft information, what you're going to review on a regular basis, you want to look at it and have a mixture of things that are backwards looking, so telling you what happened, but you also want things that are going to generate some foresight for you. So where are you starting to see signals in your data that are going to tell you that something is changing, something's happening in the marketplace that you need to do something about? It could be seeing an unusual tick in an index. All of a sudden, the price of a commodity that you're tracking starts to move up or down in a way that you were not anticipating, a sudden, very aggressive move. If you think back a year ago, last March, was March or April, when the futures contracts for fuel actually went negative. That was not something anyone ever would have anticipated or had any idea really how to address. Obviously, it's not the way now. If you deal with fuel, you understand the price is quite a bit higher than where it was 12 months ago, but fine. Where do you see that in the data? Where can you find some of those signals that give you an idea to say, hey, we need to go explore this because there's an opportunity here that we can drive value that we want to be able to get in front of? An example would be Toyota. They were one of the first people to recognize that there was an issue with semiconductors. They did what they needed to try to get in front of that in order to get supply of chips so they could maintain their production. And they were successful for quite a while, although even they now have fallen where they've said they're needing to cut their production by 40%, again, simply because those chips are not available. It's just that the global supply chain tipped too far to the idea of efficiency instead of over resiliency. And this last year has just I'm sure, as everyone knows, there's just battered supply chains to the point where, we're struggling to be able to get back in front of that.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. Sorry, did I cut you off?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
No,
I think those are great points. And I think what I keep coming back to, and I remember feeling this at the beginning of the pandemic as well, when we were seeing all these supply shortages and all these issues with pricing all over the place, and people what felt a lot like gouging in certain instances. And I remember I was actually doing an event around that time and getting, emotional sounds like a strange thing to say, but just getting very passionate about this idea. A lot of procurement 101 here. There's a lot that sometimes we sort of let the tools and let the teams do it for us. But when it comes down to it, we need to really, get into the data, dig deep into it, take the time to, as you say, understand the signals. If I'm looking at the data and I'm seeing numbers moving around and I don't know what those numbers are or what them moving around means, then I don't know nearly enough to be able to be effective with that data. Nick, I'm curious what your experience is as well, kind of being on the ground today with clients. Are you seeing clients that are implementing some of these solutions, or what do you see that they're doing effectively that others should be able to replicate?
Yep. So frankly, I'm seeing a bit of a correction. So over the past, couple years in a stationary environment, we've seen index-based contracts on a decline. They've become less popular. People have sort of moved away from them, and now the value of index-based contracts are really going to shine through, because that's one of the most effective ways to have that bi-directional price management, to have that sort of tracking to the supply chain curve. So that's one thing I've seen. I love the Toyota example that Joe provided. And actually, so Kevin Fitzgerald had a question, what tools did Toyota use that gave them the future insight on the electronic component shortage? Essentially, it was visibility into the supply chain. So a lot of people look at their main suppliers, maybe their tier 2 suppliers. Toyota had a culture where they looked at tier 2, tier 3, even tier 4. And so what that meant was kind of the waves or the ripple effect happened in those lower levels of suppliers before it came up to the tier 2 and tier 1 suppliers. And so that's what gave them the advanced knowledge. And so once they saw that, they could be like, okay, let's increase our inventory levels. That's another thing we're seeing. We're seeing a couple of different techniques and tactics come back into the forefront: vendor managed inventory, disaster management, collaborative supplier relationships, all this bread and butter stuff. But it is really going back to the basics of what makes a good category manager, what makes a good sourcing professional. It is basic. Some of these are very basic stuff, but it is things that maybe we've become a little complacent about.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really, for me, been something that I've returned to over and over again over the last, couple of years, is that, whether it's, reaching out to your suppliers and determining, how they can help you gain the insights that you need. I think sometimes we overlook the supplier visibility because it's almost like we don't want to really admit that we don't know ourselves. So we don't want to turn to them as a source of data, but I think, looking at our suppliers as a source of visibility, helping, using them and their insight to help us make sense of the data. Certainly tools can be an absolute, game changer for certain organizations. But I think, we've also seen a lot of companies who that have invested a lot of money into, very expensive analytics tools without really knowing what they're trying to get from them. And as a result, it doesn't really change anything. Maybe the data looks prettier, but they still don't really know what it's telling them.
I would say tools don't fix bad processes. They just make them faster.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I think so. I mean, don't be afraid to look at the tools. We have little plug here. We have our own tool, the ProcureAbility. Don't be afraid to look at those tools. But again, go in with, what am I trying to really use this for? And if you're using it to try to fix your data, it's probably not going to give you the result that you're looking for. So I know we have just a few minutes left in this session. I know we have seen a couple of comments come in through the chat, which I love. But if anybody has any questions or any, we'd be happy to take a couple now. And if we run out of time, we can always follow back up after the session as well. So Joe, Nick, while we're sort of waiting to see if any questions come in, I guess any last minute, kind of closing comments from you guys?
Yeah, I would say, I think the last point we're looking at is, in the environment that we're in now, it is different. We've not really seen significant inflation for at least the last 10 years, probably really going back mainly about the last 20 years. So we need to get in front of that and think about some of the different tools, and tools is not the right word there, but think about the different ways that we can measure value and add value as a procurement organization. It's not necessarily going to be about dollars and cents. And while a lot of stakeholders don't like talking about cost avoidance, that is something that needs to be part of the discussion. Doing index-based contracts and index-based pricing is going to be something that's going to come back in and be a little bit different. Looking at your supply chain holistically, understanding where are your suppliers, where are your suppliers, where are you producing things, where do you have opportunities, where are you exposed that you have risks that you may not be anticipating, where do you have opportunities that come across that? Really, can you take that total cost of ownership perspective? So it's not about just getting that widget for a few cents less, but it's making sure you're getting widgets today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and taking that perspective so that your company can continue to function and to focus and to execute the way that they need to. That's really where there's going to be value that procurement's able to drive that is different from what we've done historically. Right.
And Nick, I see you put some comments in the chat. If you want to put a little voiceover to that, I like that. It's very simple, but really powerful.
Yeah. So I mean, that's basically a good mantra to follow. Is data is just like the raw numbers, the indexes, the data sources. But then you have to convert that into insight, which is, what does this mean? How does this impact me, my category plan, my sourcing project? And then you take that insight, how does this affect me? And then what can I do about it? How can I incorporate this into my category plan? And how can I become a proactive instead of a reactive procurement organization? And the final thought would be, it's really easy to look at this environment and say, oh my God, there's so many problems, there's cost increases, there's obstacles. It is a challenging environment, and we are going to have to adapt and be flexible. But this is also a really good opportunity for any sort of procurement division or professional, because you can drive cultural change at the leadership level to look beyond just supply chain efficiency and look at resiliency. You can drive closer partnerships with suppliers. You can create that competitive edge over other procurement divisions that aren't going back to the basics and asking the right questions.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point to end on, a kind of a rallying cry for procurement, which I know Phil and Kelly are always with me on that one.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.